Parties clash over the venue access as election campaigns peak. Heads of state in Addis Ababa for the African Union Summit set to kick off Sunday. And the U.S. tells the Somali National Army to step up the fight against Al-Shabaab. Hello everyone, welcome to Africa Live on CGTN with me, Beatrice Marshall in Nairobi. Also coming up this hour. In our Turkana series, we take a tour of the Loyangalani Desert Museum, the only one of its kind in the region. We start this broadcast in South Sudan, where a United Nations helicopter has crashed in Abyei State. Reports said the aircraft was attempting to land at the time of the accident. At least 4 passengers have been killed. We will get you more on the story as we get the details and get clearer information. For now, let's go to Nigeria, where the Nigeria's ruling party has held a rally 1 week ahead of elections in Africa's most populous nation. Tens of thousands of Buhari supporters turned up for the event in the commercial hub of Lagos. Nigeria heads to the polls next Saturday. A record of just over 84 million voters are registered this year, up 18% from 2015. Buhari wants a second 4-year term, while his contender Atiku Abubakar is hoping to finally secure the presidency after 4 previous attempts. The elections are the 6th to be held since Nigeria returned to civilian rule in 1999 after decades of military government. Meanwhile, the main opposition party, the People's Democratic Party, has suspended its presidential campaign rally in Nigeria, which was supposed to be held in the country's capital, Abuja. The venue was shut down by the government. Our correspondent Philly has a report from Abuja.
PDP's National Publicity Secretary Kola Ologbondiyan says the party decided to postpone its campaign in Abuja indefinitely because of government interference. Mr. Ologbondiyan says the party fulfilled all necessary requirements to use the old parade ground venue for its rally. He claims the government issued a last-minute order to stop the event. Although the government denies PDP's claims of intimidation, no reason has been given for preventing the rally. Analysts say the upcoming elections are a potentially divisive time for the country.
Nigeria must first be united and must be seen to be united. And the leader can only do this by first leading by example, by demonstrating that we are all one people. Rally around the entire section of the country around the common purpose. Only then can you have all hands on deck to fix the economy, to secure the country, and to fight a comprehensive, holistic war on corruption that will enable Nigeria to save enough money from its bigger resources to be able to be channeled into more productive ventures.
Abubakar Atiku, a former vice president and PDP presidential aspirant, is up against incumbent President Muhammadu Buhari of the ruling All Progressives Congress, APC. Mr. Atiku promises to tackle insecurity, boost the economy, create jobs, and unite the country if he wins the elections. President Buhari, on the other hand, is seeking a second term in office to consolidate on his work of fighting corruption, revamping the economy, and tackling insecurity. The poll is being seen as one of the most fiercely contested in Nigeria's history. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja, Nigeria.
The African Union's 32nd summit is underway in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Heads of state and governments have started arriving in Addis Ababa to deliberate on priority issues ranging from refugees, peace and security, as well as the African Union reform. The summit is expected to pass important decisions to strengthen Africa's development agenda. Here's CGTN's Girum Chala with more.
The 2 days Executive Council meeting wrapped with a major emphasis on several issues of the continent. The theme of this 32nd Assembly of the Union deals with refugees, returnees and internally displaced people. It is said the summit must pass stronger decisions before the situation spirals out of control.
The theme of this year is devoted to the issue of refugees, returnees and internally displaced persons. This choice reflects the renewed will of our leaders to find a lasting response to the burning issue of this forced displacement of persons. We have a dual responsibility. But Africa, while continuing to seek the support of the international community, should contribute more significantly to the mobilization of humanitarian assistance.
The figures presented to these foreign ministers showed how alarming the issue of refugees and IDPs has become in Africa. Today in Africa, there are 14.7 million internally displaced people and 7.3 million refugees.
In the first 6 months of 2018, only 2 million new people were displaced, mainly from 5 countries: Central African Republic, Nigeria, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Somalia. Women are often the hardest hit. The female population of refugees is about 57% in 2017. Africa has the second highest burden of displacement, hosting about 37% of the world's 19.6 million refugees.
During the weekend, the African Union summit at the level of heads of state is expected to also discuss many other agenda items, among which are the issue of AU reform and peace and security in Africa. 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the 1969 OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa, and the 10th anniversary of the 2009 African Union Convention for the Protection and Assistance of Internally Displaced Persons in the continent. That is the Kampala Convention. Now, after half a century, Africa is yet to achieve full control over its refugee and IDPs related problems. Grumjala, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
And I'll be discussing events at the African Union Summit later on Talk Africa at 17:30 GMT. To stay tuned. Now, the outgoing head of the U.S. Africa Command says American military force alone will not be enough to defeat Al-Shabaab in Somalia. General Thomas Vodhosa says the Somali National Army needs to step up. From Washington, D.C., here's Daniel Renches with more.
Since April of 2017, which was early in the tenure of President Donald Trump, the US military was given far greater authority to take military action to strike al-Shabaab from the air and to assist Somali and African Union forces on the ground. In his final testimony to the US Senate Armed Services Committee before leaving his job as commander of AFRICOM, General Thomas Waldhauser detailed 47 strikes in 2018 and 12 so far in 2019. He told Senate lawmakers that he repeatedly delivered this message to Somali President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo and Prime Minister Hassan Ali Khaire.
At the end of the day, these strikes are not going to defeat al-Shabaab, but they're going to provide the opportunity for the federal government and the Somali National Army to grow and assume the security of that country. The strikes won't defeat. We know that they are causing problems. We know that they are deterring. It's an open question as to how much, but we know it's causing al-Shabaab problems, giving this opportunity for the government. But the bottom line is the Somali National Army needs to grow, it needs to step up, and it needs to take responsibility for their own security.
General Waldhauser also made it clear that the US military effort is only one of the pieces of the puzzle. He endorsed efforts by the international community, including the US Agency for International Development, to promote Somali economic, social and political governance. Those elements, he said, were crucial parts of the Somali transition strategy designed to address the drivers of the conflict. Daniel Renches, CGTN, Washington.
You're watching Africa Live, still ahead on the program. 7 jihadis get life sentences for the deadly 2015 Tunisian attacks. And Nigerian musicians sing for the election.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice. Africa Live. Find your voice.
A Tunisian court has sentenced 7 jihadists to life in prison over attacks at a museum and on a beach in 2015 that killed 60 people, many of them tourists. The prosecution's spokesman, Sofiane Siliti, said 3 were given life sentences for homicide over the first attack in March 2015 at the capital's Bardo Museum, in which 2 gunmen killed 21 foreign tourists and a Tunisian security guard. 4 received the same term for the shooting rampage at a Sousse tourist resort in June that year, which killed 38 people, mostly British tourists. Dozens of defendants faced 2 separate trials over the closely linked shootings, which occurred just months apart in Tunis and Sousse. Several defendants pointed to the fugitive Shamseddin Sandi as the mastermind of both. The second edition of the Africa Health Expo has begun in the capital of the Ivorian capital, Abidjan. The event brings together professionals from the pharmaceutical, drugstore industry, medicine and traditional medicine from over 10 African countries. It aims to promote a pharmaceutical sector that respects international standards on the continent. Under the theme, the quality approach for the development of health systems and the well-being of populations. The African Expo also offers a platform for the exchange between professionals of traditional medicine and the professionals of modern medicine.
It should be noted that the world pharmaceutical turnover amounted to more than $1,105 billion in 2016 and is expected to increase to more than $1.4 trillion by 2021. But the African continent only accounts for 0% of this market, and 10 African countries, including Cote d'Ivoire, account for 70% of the African pharmaceutical market. And yet we know that the pharmaceutical industry is a major challenge, both economically and in terms of health. This industry can contribute to the production quality of pharmaceutical products with better profitability and cost.
And now to our ongoing series, The Treasures of Turkana. The Loyangalani Desert Museum in Kenya's north is the only one of its kind in East Africa. It aims to preserve the cultures and traditions of the local communities by preserving their most important artifacts.
It is built in a semicircle in the fashion of a local traditional homestead. This is the Loyangalani Desert Museum, a treasure trove tucked away in the Marsabit Desert, overlooking the Jade Sea, or Lake Turkana as it's popularly known. Loyangalani means a place of many trees in the local Samburu language. The museum houses a variety of items showing off the cultures and the traditions of the communities that live in Loyangalani.
It houses the history of 6 communities. Every important cultural item is kept here in the museum.
The communities whose cultures are showcased here include the El Molo, the Rendile, Samburu, Turkana, Dasanach, and the Somali people. The items range from wooden and metallic tools to weapons and furniture, traditional garments, livestock management items like the old wooden bells traditionally hung on the livestock, and photographs of the communities that have long lived side by side in this region. They tell stories that the people want to remember. The National Museums of Kenya refurbished the structure and opened it in 2014. Located about 700 kilometers from the capital, Nairobi, the museum is unlike any other in the region.
International and local tourists come to see what we have here. They pay a fee to enter and the money helps the museum.
Visitors can stay in self-contained cottages in the museum, taking in the rich cultural traditions nurtured by interactions among the different ethnic groups, while local businesses benefit from the arrival of tourists. And as long as the museum remains, locals find comfort in the thought that their stories will live on long after they are gone. The items in this museum are a tribute to the past, with locals determined to remember their history and how they adapted in order to survive. Wilkisanyabo, CGTN in Loyangalani, Kenya.
Let's return to Nigeria now, where the Lagos-Ibadan railway project has held a test-taking ceremony from Lagos to Ogun State. The Nigerian Minister of Transport, Rotimi Emaki, took the train and inspected the construction of the project. This is the first two-lane standard railway in West Africa built by a Chinese company. It's been in construction for nearly 2 years and is expected to be fully operational by 2020. The railway is also the second modern railway built in Nigeria in accordance with Chinese standards and technology. The Lagos-Ibadan railway line has a total length of 156.08 kilometers and a design speed of 150 kilometers per hour. The total investment of the project is $1.581 billion.
We hope that after the completion of this railway, it will greatly ease the traffic pressure of Lagos to Ogun State and promote the development of the Nigerian economy.
And staying in Nigeria, youth in the country are adding their voice to the ongoing election debate in a different way. Some 10 young musicians have been experimenting with lyrics and vocal arrangements in songs about good governance, inclusive dialogue and political representation.
In order to promote youthful conversations around Nigeria's election, Accountability Lab Nigeria has embarked on a competition dubbed Voice to Rep. The project aims to mentor upcoming musicians to distribute socially conscious music.
We've gone through a lot of trainings, they've made us see a lot of things, and I see the difference. I see that it's important to actually always speak out. It's even whatever tool you have, and for me it's music, and I feel like after leaving this place, it's going to be a great difference because the songs that I put out will be more conscious.
A lot of people have spoken about participation, about governance, about different things, and there's no better time to talk about it than now. You know, it's been 4 years since our last election, and a lot of things that may have been forgotten. It's easier to remember something that is that happens closest to the election period.
Music has played an important role in Nigerian elections, with influential artists supporting candidates through public endorsements and campaign anthem compositions.
In the past, I have supported one or two candidates that I knew personally and I felt were fit for office. But right now, I think that the greater conversation is about what young people need to see in terms of competence in office, and that's the lane I'm in right now.
Despite having no prize money attached to it, the Voice to Rep competition is a platform for young musicians to focus on Nigeria's social development agenda.
We have young people who are making socially conscious music for good governance, for elections, for women's participation in governance, and also for the private sector integrity as well. So we engage these people to make music and train them, mentor them, give them the platform to reach out to Nigerians, speak to Nigerians, engage Nigerians, and inform Nigerians as well to ask questions and hold government accountable.
Nigerian youths are hopeful that the upcoming polls will give way for leaders who will address their unemployment challenges. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
Thank you. And your sports news coming up next. Here's what's ahead. South African coach Otis Gibson linked with the England job after the upcoming Cricket World Cup.
Africa, where champions are made, records are broken, legends are born. We're there for every goal, for every knockout, for every step of the way. Match Point, only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
And we begin with cricket news, where a newspaper report during the South African series against Pakistan claimed that the Proteas head coach Otis Gibson looks set to replace the beleaguered England coach Trevor Bayliss after the World Cup. Gibson has refused to comment on the matter, but the reality is that he could well be lost to South African cricket in just a few months' time. Here's CGTN CS Du Plessis with more.
There's no doubt that the West Indian has had a huge impact on South African cricket. His relationship with the players has been positive, and he has breathed new life into a talented group of players. But the Protea coach could be on his way out if he fails to meet a key mandate in his agreement with Cricket South Africa.
His contract was set up in a way that he has to win the World Cup for South Africa, and then they'll think about extensions or no extensions. So for him, I think it's still business as usual, and they'll probably think about what happens to his future after the World Cup.
Gibson's approach to the national team has been refreshing and has allowed many players to flourish on the international stage.
He's brought in a whole new culture of giving guys chances, testing out new plans, playing aggressive cricket. Sometimes it didn't come off all that well all the time, but I think him and Faf also, they found great partners in each other. And I think with a partnership of Otis and Faf, South African cricket can go from strength to strength.
The plan has always been to experiment ahead of the World Cup, and the upcoming series against Sri Lanka will be the last opportunity for the former England bowling coach to mix and match.
Unfortunately, he had a couple of guys out injured. Depi Dumini, Lungingidi wasn't available for him. So I think in the Sri Lanka series, we'll get to see what is close to the makeup of the World Cup squad.
South Africa have never won the biggest prize in world cricket, and although the Proteas have been a dominant force since the last World Cup, they go into the tournament as dark horses instead of title contenders.
Cautiously, we can be excited. I don't think the Proteas are by a long shot the favourites for the tournament. I think India and England will be the favourites, and rightly so. But I think the Proteas should be able to make a semi-final spot. So I think if the batsmen can pull through, we do have the bowlers to do damage early on in the innings, and then the Proteas might just surprise. But I don't think they're the favourites at the moment.
Gibson can't be blamed for putting out feelers, as winning the World Cup is a tall order, even for a talented group like South Africa. Either way, Gibson sits in a win-win situation, because if he wins the World Cup, he keeps his job and becomes a South African hero. But if he doesn't, he could still waltz straight into the Australians' job at the ECB in September. CS Du Plessis, CGTN, Johannesburg.
Players and fans paid tribute to Emiliano Sala on Friday ahead of the League One match between Lyon and Marseille. Sala was killed when the small plane he was travelling in went down over the English Channel last month following his move to Cardiff City from Nantes. There was a silence followed by an applause at the Stade Gaston Gerrard in a match that eventually finished 2-1 to Marseille. Elsewhere, the Argentine footballer's family grieved also on Friday after British authorities formally identified his body from the wreckage of the plane.
At least I know we're going to have him here and to go with a flower and remember him forever.
About the news, when his body was identified, it was obviously a very hard blow. This nightmare started over 2 weeks ago, and it will still go on. We are going to find answers even if we don't know whether it's necessary to look for it. And obviously, we will ask that justice be done.
In the NBA, JJ Redick scored season-high 34 points as the new-look Philadelphia 76ers beat the Denver Nuggets 117-110 on Friday night. Redick hit a three-pointer early in the second quarter to give the 76ers a 41-29 lead. He hit yet another three in the third quarter to put his team up 68-64. Cameroonian Joel Embiid would also then sink a basket with Philadelphia up by 1. Nuggets did make a fight back, and Nikola Jokic's basket in the fourth tied the game at 101 apiece. However, Ben Simmons' dunk put Philadelphia up 111-105, and from then on, the 76ers closed out the game at 117-110. To tennis news now, Roger Federer and Jean Borg helped to launch the third edition of the Laver Cup on Friday, which will see Team Europe take on Team World in Geneva, Switzerland in September. The tournament sees the cream of European talent take on their counterparts from the rest of the world, with Borg and John Munro, the respective captains. Team Europa are currently unbeaten in Laver Cup tennis, having won the inaugural event in Prague in the Czech Republic in 2017 before retaining the title in Chicago, USA a year later. The 2019 edition will be staged at the Expo Convention Center in Geneva from the 20th to the 22nd of September.
Pictures show, and people who saw them, the intensity was crazy, you know, in Prague and in Chicago, and I loved every moment about it. I also was extremely nervous, of course, because it is different playing in front of, you know, a Rafa or a Novak or a Bjorn, and it gets your heart going, but and I'm sure it's going to be the same again here in Geneva.
And that's it on this edition of Africa Live. Remember, you can send your feedback to the contact on the screen and follow us on our digital media platform. Thank you for watching. I'll return shortly with Talk Africa. Tonight, we'll be focusing on the African Union Summit taking place tomorrow in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Stay tuned.
This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
According to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, there are over 68 million internally displaced people globally, and the number of refugees is over 25 million. Sub-Saharan Africa hosts more than 26% of the world's refugees. African heads of state will be meeting in Addis Ababa for the annual African Union Summit beginning on February the 10th to discuss, amongst other things, possible solutions to the African migration crisis. So how effective will the African Union be in finding solutions to forced migration? And what direction will the African Union take in 2019? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, ahead of the two-day Heads of State Summit, Africa's foreign ministers called for stronger action on Africa's refugee crisis. My colleague Girum Chala with more from Addis Ababa. Take a listen.
The 2 days Executive Council meeting wrapped with a major emphasis on several issues of the continent. The theme of this 32nd Assembly of the Union deals with refugees, returnees and internally displaced people. It is said the summit must pass stronger decisions before the situation spirals out of control.
The theme of this year is devoted to the issue of refugees, returnees and internally displaced persons. This choice reflects the renewed will of our leaders to find a lasting response to the burning issue of the forced displacement of persons. We have a dual responsibility in Africa. While continuing to seek the support of the international community, we should contribute more significantly to the mobilization of humanitarian assistance.
The figures presented to these foreign ministers showed how alarming the issue of refugees and IDPs has become in Africa. Today in Africa, there are 14.7 million internally displaced people and 7.3 million refugees.
In the first 6 months of 2018, only 2 million new people were displaced, mainly from 5 countries: Central African Republic, Nigeria, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Somalia. Women are often the hardest hit. The female population of refugees is about 57% in 2017. Africa has the second highest burden of displacement, hosting about 37% of the world's 19.6 million refugees.
During the weekend, the African Union Summit at the level of heads of state is expected to also discuss many other agenda items, among which are the issue of AU reform and peace and security in Africa. 2019 marks the 50th anniversary of the 1969 OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa, and the 10th anniversary of the 2009 African Union Convention for the protection and assistance of internally displaced persons in the continent. That is the Kampala Convention. Now, after half a century, Africa is yet to achieve full control over its refugee and IDPs related problems. Grumjala, CGTN, Addis Ababa.
Well, let's broaden this discussion a little bit further and find out exactly what African heads of state will be discussing in Addis Ababa. Joining me now to unpack the African Union in 2019 from Johannesburg, Dr. Francis Onditi. He's a fellow at the Human Sciences Research Council in Pretoria. From Cairo, Dr. Ziad Akol, political analyst and researcher at the Al-Akram Center for Security and Strategic Studies. And with me in Nairobi, Professor Peter Kagwanja, President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to Talk Africa tonight. Professor Kagwanja, I'll start off with you. But gentlemen, I want to get your views on this. Africa's leadership at the African Union will this year concentrate on the issue of refugees, returnees, internally displaced people. This is not a new issue for Africa. Why are they discussing this now? Is it because Europe and the United States have begun rejecting migrants from across the globe?
Yeah, first and foremost, internationally, there is the movement for a new compact on refugees. But if you look at the direction that the compact is taking, it is basically to find an alternative area of settlement of African refugees, because we are beginning to see a fortress Europe or a fortress West, where African refugees are not welcome. And therefore, Africa need to have a solution for its own problems.
Right. Dr. Ombiti in Johannesburg, your thoughts? Let's hear your thoughts on this.
I think something important we need to know is that Africa is not, it doesn't lack a framework on management of refugees. You remember the 2018-2027, the framework, policy framework, which also developed what we call the action plan for refugee management is very much in place. So I believe the framework, the legal framework and policy exist. What would be important also is going back to the Agenda 2063 to realize that, for example, aspiration number 2, which talks about democracy, governance, and rule of law. So if we can put these things in order in African states, I think we can reduce on the number of refugees. Probably what we should be having, or what we should be talking about, are refugees who are going in other countries perhaps to provide African expertise, but not economic or conflict-related refugees.
Right.
So
let me jump in there, Dr. Onditi, because Dr. Akula, I want to get your view, because North Africa is generally a migration hub there. Why do you think the African Union heads of state are going to be discussing this whole question of refugees, particularly with impact to the hub there, the North African Maghreb?
Hello. First of all, I think that the political disturbances that the North African region has witnessed in the past few years have created new challenges and have made new international pressures that are being practiced on African countries or the African Union as an organization. Therefore, the issue of migration and refugees right now is starting to create political tensions in the countries that receive these African migrants. And that's why this issue has become very high on top of the African Union agenda. And in 2019, while dealing with conflict zones in the continent, the issue of migrants will become of paramount importance, because on one hand, there is a very negative impact on the African inside, and on the other hand, there's a lot of international pressure coming from either Europe or the US to actually try and stop this phenomenon.
So there is a lot of pressure, Professor Kagwanya, there is a lot of pressure from Europe and the West generally to stop this phenomenon. But you did mention earlier on about the compact for migration, but the United States did not sign earlier on. Several other countries have followed suit. Why are there withdrawals, though, from this compact?
I think there is a kind of a pushback in terms of supporting refugees globally, and the United States, as you know, is itself taking a position that is anti-migration. That's what we've seen, at least the rhetoric during the campaign for President Donald Trump. Now, the key issue here, I think, and why the African Union has decided to take this as an issue, is that Africans need now to begin looking at the core issues that are driving Africans out of the continent. In terms of the West, it's still facing an economic downturn, and therefore very few countries are able to kind of welcome large numbers. Remember, migration issue is what has given rise to populism in the West. It is what is giving rise to isolationism as part of the policies that are being voted. Brexit was about migrations. In the entire of Europe, we have seen those forces. Therefore, it is incumbent upon Africa to begin searching for solutions to its own problems. And this search is not starting with the AU summit. It started a year or two ago with regional economic communities. IGAD itself adopted a kind of in its summit in Nairobi, adopted a resolution that is going to cater for its own refugees within the region. And therefore, it is important to highlight that this is Africa's determination.
Right, this is Africa's determination. Dr. Onditi, do you agree, though, there's a pushback in supporting refugees and therefore Africa must take, you know, the forefront? But also, we also need to look at exactly what it is that is driving Africans out of the continent.
Beatrice, you'll remember that one of the things that is making the West, you know, anti-immigrants is basically what Professor Kagwanja, you know, calls populism. But there's also a lot of sovereignty, people feeling that, you know, there is a threat, you know, influx of refugees from Africa, from other parts of the world. You know, they are not sure what they are carrying. Either they are security threat, economic threat, or even sometimes, especially in Western Europe, they have even raised the issues of cultural degradation. So if you look at, if you combine this, it tells you that the future of Africa, as far as immigration is concerned, it's in the hands of African states themselves. And we did mention, and Professor did mention earlier, that one of the things, you know, the governance, good governance, putting structures in place that will enable, you know, our political, you know, processes to allow people, you know, get opportunities here. And even in situations where, for example, right, we've got a forced migration, I think African countries can accommodate this, you know, through interstate cooperation, which is provided within the action plan of 2018 to 2027, clearly stipulated. So if we can revoke that, I think Africans can lead or can take, you know, the responsibility of their immigrants, but more importantly, looking at good governance to ensure that even if there were, you know, immigrants, right, there are people who are going to add value to Europe and not a liability.
Dr. Akel, the future of Africa and Africa's refugees is in the hands of the African states. Clearly, countries like Egypt have suffered as a result of what is happening in Libya. Let's look back again and see how much effort, though, has Africa previously put in solving this crisis of refugees.
Well, I think that perhaps the African Union did not do a lot of initiatives towards this matter. First of all, because you still have zones of conflict within the continent. You still have a lot of destabilization, whether in Sinai, in Egypt, in Libya, in Nigeria, in Niger. So you have a lot of a phase where not necessarily an answer could be developed right now. And this is the new challenge that Egypt has to face as head of the African Union and as someone who will be contributing to the policies of Africa towards this matter. I believe that the level of effort practiced over the past few years, specifically since 2011, has not been quite enough, that the African Union has been in a phase of lack of cooperation between the different African nations. We are talking about 55 countries, right, that if they cooperated, if the framework of cooperation is found, it could be done to improve things. But this has not been going on in the past few years.
Professor, very briefly, the African Union has not done much in solving the refugee crisis. Very briefly, as we go to the break.
I don't think so. I would argue that from 1969, Africa recognized the need to protect its own refugees and internally displaced, and therefore adopted the convention, the 1969 convention, which is more advanced than the global framework. Again, very recently, in March 2017, the 9 or so countries in the Horn of Africa region adopted what we call the Nairobi Declaration on Durable Solutions to Refugees. And it's one of the most generous, has been held by the United Nations and other actors as one of the most innovative approach to the refugee problems. What the AU is doing is basically to push to a higher notch that initiative that has been undertaken at the regional level. I think one can call upon the international community to begin supporting Africa in regard to doing this. And I'm sure we're going to get to the next subject, which is Africa is stabilizing its own neighborhood in order to to see is producing new generations of refugees.
Right, and gentlemen, we'll stop there for the moment to stay with us. We are going to take a short break now. When we return, we'll have more on what lies ahead for the African Union in 2019. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Here with me, Dr. Francis Onditi in Johannesburg, Dr. Ziad Akel in Cairo, and Professor Peter Kagwanja with me here in studio. Well, the African Union may be discussing about refugees, returnees and migrants in Africa, but there are also other issues being the focus there at the African Union. Dr. Ziad Akel, let's start off with what is happening now at the African Union. This summit will also see Rwanda's Paul Kagame handing over the chairmanship of the African Union to President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi of Egypt. So what exactly do you think the agenda will be for President el-Sisi?
Well, first of all, Egypt is very much concerned about its role in Africa. It is maybe 2019 is the year that Egypt is trying to recreate or revive its foreign policies, specifically towards Africa. There are issues, first of all, related to security, and I'm not just talking about hard security, I'm talking about food security, water security, and as well as countering radicalization and terrorism in the continent, and developing new frameworks of economic cooperation with African nations. Also, on working on industrialization and creating a manufacturing sector that Egypt believes that Africa possesses or has all what it takes to stop or to at least reduce its imports from the international community. So right. There are political issues, there are development-related issues, and there are security-related issues that are on the agenda of Egypt towards the African Union, and it's one of the most important files in Egyptian foreign policy at the moment.
Dr. Onditi, your take though, what do you see though? How do you view the African Union chairmanship under President el-Sisi? Because President Kagame's tenure was full of African Union reforms, and Ziad Akel has told us that Egypt has remained concerned about its exact role in Africa.
Well, the two leaders, President Sisi and Kagame, seem to be left and east and west, in my view. While Kagame has been practicing a lot of creative, what you could call creative governance, which he has tried to project at the AU. You remember the reforms in finance, the reforms in structuring AU. It is actually the baby child of President Kagame. So that is really something that requires, the leisure of time and creativity in terms of how AU need to be governed. But President Sisi his plate is already full. The Arab Spring, some elements of Arab Spring and conflicts are not yet settled. So I'm not sure it's really going to be hands-on. President Kagame left.
Professor Kagwanja.
I think there are three tasks that President Sisi must achieve for the African Union. First, he has to continue the reforms towards financial sustainability of the African Union, particularly its peace and security architecture. Second, Egypt has been a victim of terrorism. He has to up the Africa's game in countering violent extremism on the continent. Sinai has been a victim of the same, and therefore much is expected from him. Third, I think he still has to deepen Africa's democracy. Paradoxically, Egypt is one of the countries that was kicked out of the African Union under his tenure, and now he has come back at the top. And the question at the heart of that is Africa's democracy. So he's going to be looked upon to see how he's going to respond to democracy. He himself being a hard power man. But I think the main challenges of Assisi is how he's going to deal with the geopolitics from the Middle East. Egypt being both Africa and Middle East, and the Middle East now being having countries that are divided and meddling with Africa's politics, particularly in Somalia. How then is he going to deal with this particular question?
So, gentlemen, we are going to wind up shortly, but I do want to get a final comment from all of you. Dr. Ziad Akol, we saw the African Union theme in 2018 being that of corruption. We are now seeing another theme this year of refugees, returnees, and migration. Is this just another theme and another year? Is it going to be another year and another theme? What's your thought?
I think any international organization needs to bring up new themes every single year. And if we are talking about migration and people who are displaced because it is a pressing issue right now, then we should definitely consider other themes next year's. For example, we have the issue of youth, because we are talking about a majority of a population composed of people under 35 years old. And also, we have to consider the issue of education and of human rights. So, of course, migration and displacement is very important, but of course, the African Union needs to focus on a different issue every single year.
Dr. Oniti, your take, is this just another theme and another year? Do we expect concrete results out of this?
I believe issues of corruption and, immigration are intertwined, and they boil down to what we call, issues of governance, especially how African states are going to refine their domestic policy will really determine two things. One, they will have really to adopt the creative governance that we've seen some African states move with. And then secondly, interstate cooperation will be very important in combating especially immigration that has been very risky and it continues to be a threat to African security and peace.
Professor Kagwanja.
I think Africa has stayed with the major theme of peace and security as enablers of development. And the issue of corruption is part of that in terms of governance. And I think moving forward with Al-Sisi as the incoming chair of the African Union, Africa will have to stay with the question of stability. We'll have to stay with the question of accountability so that you don't produce the numbers of refugees, and at the same time to avoid the humanitarian crisis that Africa has been battling with, whether you're talking about Congo. And that's why the focus on elections in Africa is key. The focus on deepening democracy in Africa is important.
Well, if you look at it, though, Professor Kagwanja, if they are to make this, turn this into concrete action, same as with the Compact for Migration, what do you think the African Union then should focus on one single thing?
I think the African Union should focus squarely on stability of the continent. It is instability that is the root cause of the refugee crisis. Secondly, it should focus on good governance. By good governance, we mean transparency, a transparent and accountable regime of operation. That means that Africa is going to enhance development. It's going to, improve the welfare of its people and basically build up its own prosperity. And like Europe, which is not sending refugees to Africa, Africa will be sending expatriates. As my colleague Beatrice said, we need to see engineers, not as refugees.
All right. And strategic studies and Professor